We come back to a topic like the one this evening. Not only do we want to get to grips with it ourselves, but we want to be able to engage intelligently and graciously with questions and issues that people raise. So we're very grateful to John for allowing us the opportunity to ask him questions in this area. We have loads of questions. I have to say straight away, there's not a chance that we'll be able to deal with them all. And it's been very difficult, actually, to batch them. So I'm going to invite John back up, if that's okay. And you've got some, you're clutching some there, John, which are centered around a particular topic. Do you want to tell us what that is? Yes, please.
So there are a number of questions to do with current medical treatment. What's going on in the NHS and in terms of dying in the NHS. So here's one. As a hospital palliative care physician, I see many patients being treated and treated and treated just because there's nearly always another treatment. I see few patients being asked what they want. It seems in Western medical care that we just don't know when to let go. And I'm afraid, I totally agree with that there is a huge amount of over-treatment going on within the NHS. And paradoxically, there is evidence in the States that people who come from a religious background and who use religious coping as a way of coping with a terminal illness are actually more likely to insist on having futile medical treatment. They're more likely to die in an intensive care unit rather than die at home. They're less likely to have a do not resuscitate order, and they're less likely to have nominated somebody else to take decisions on their account. So paradoxically, it seems that religious people are often the worst when it comes to saying enough is enough. And I think that there is a great deal of education required. I think there is a complex mix of factors which is leading to this epidemic of overtreatment. And some of it, to be honest, is the fears of doctors and medical staff and hospital staff, and an inability to recognize the futility that when time is enough is enough. Paradoxically, doctors are not well trained in recognizing when a patient is dying, recognizing when treatment is futile. And many doctors have their own deep fears and uncertainties which cause them to go on and on and on and to fight and battle against death. Patients again, and often it's relatives, interestingly, it's often relatives who are insisting that everything possible is done, insisting that the patient is admitted to intensive care, insisting that they have this latest experimental treatment, and so on. So there are a whole mix of factors, and I think the tragic thing, therefore, is that though people say they want to die in their beds at home at peace, in reality, so many people will die in a hospital, in an intensive care unit with failed cardiopulmonary resuscitation, with tubes coming out of every orifice. A horrific way to die. And all those opportunities of dying well are stripped away, and instead they die often in extreme distress and agony and in a very unpleasant way, surrounded by machines. And it's all completely unnecessary. So I think there is a great deal we need to think about and to educate ourselves. And partly, we need to have the conversation. We need to start talking among ourselves and to our loved ones about how we want to die. It's too late by the time I'm admitted to the ITU and I have tubes coming out of every orifice. I need to have the conversation now with my loved ones to talk about what it means and what's really important to me and what I would want and what I would not want. Unfortunately, that kind of conversation is also the most difficult one to have. I know in our family how difficult it is to have those conversations with some of our elderly relatives. So it's not an easy thing to have, and yet I do think it's really important. I do think there is a place for a number of things. So there's a place for writing what's called a living will, or an advanced refusal to treatment. Personally, I think it's fairly limited. There are legally binding documents you can write where you can't insist on having a treatment, but you can basically refuse specific treatments, and you can refuse them in advance. In reality, I think that those kind of statements often turn out not to be very relevant when the crisis actually strikes. What I think is helpful is something which is called an advanced statement of values, where you write down what is important to you, what really matters to you, who you would like to be present if you were dying, the fact that it's important that your friends, that your relatives, that the pastor of the local church, whatever it is, these things. And actually in my book, in the appendix, I've written an example statement of values for Christian believers as the sort of document, though it's not legally binding, it's actually very helpful for other people. It's helpful for doctors and other professionals to have a document like that, because they genuinely want to do what you want, what your wishes are, but if they're not being expressed, if they're not being written down, it's actually very hard for medical professionals and others to follow the wishes of what you want. So there is a place. There's also a place for lasting power of attorney, where you can nominate another person, a loved one it could be, or it could be a relative, it could be a lawyer, it could be a close friend, who then has the legal power to make decisions on your behalf, including health decisions about treatment. And the government has made it much easier now. You don't need to spend a lot of money on a lawyer. You can actually, there's a website where you can fill out a lasting power of attorney and nominate the people who you want to have that without having to go through a lot of expense or legal complications. So I think there are definite advantages about that. You do need to think about the level of responsibility that you're putting on another person. That with a lasting power of attorney, you are putting onto another person an extraordinary level of potential legal responsibility. That the doctors will come to them and say, "Do you think we should switch off this machine or not?" And they carry ultimate legal responsibility for those decisions. And I sometimes worry about the psychological and emotional responsibility that you are putting onto another person who hasn't been trained. You're taking in that situation the kind of decisions which a consultant takes after 15 years of experience and training in the health care world, but you're now, as a layperson, suddenly finding yourself taking those kind of awesome medical decisions. So there may be disadvantages with that as well, but it's certainly something to consider. There's a question about the Liverpool Care Pathway. The Liverpool Care Pathway, again, I discussed this in some detail in the book, and I can't really go into the details now. The Liverpool Care Pathway was an attempt to take the very best learning out of the hospices and out of experts in palliative care who'd done nothing else and built up experience over 20, 30 years. Take that very best learning and put it into a form that an inexperienced, newly qualified doctor or junior staff nurse would be able to put into practice when they were caring for a dying person in the NHS. The motivation was noble, but surprise, surprise, trying to take all the skill and learning and expertise of an experienced palliative care doctor and turn it into a tick box exercise for inexperienced staff turned out to be, in many cases, unsuccessful, and sometimes there were some really quite appalling things that happened, not out of some malevolent desire to bump off as many people, but just out of lack of training, lack of understanding, lack of support. So the Liverpool Care Pathway was removed, and there was a very good review produced by a number of eminent people, and the conclusion of their report was less pathway, more care. And I think that was exactly right. In other words, rather than try and have a tick box approach, what we needed to do was to train junior people and inexperienced people in the care of the dying and to do it more effectively. So there's still, I think, some other kind of guidelines and practical guidelines for the care of dying people in the NHS hospital will need to be reintroduced. Sadly, only a small minority of all people die in a hospice or surrounded with getting really excellent palliative care. Increasingly, the idea is that palliative care should be available in the community, not just in hospices and not just in hospital wards. And again, to my immense frustration, palliative care services are massively underfunded in this country. So we pour in vast, literally billions of pounds into new cancer research, into heart disease, into genetic research, into finding more and more wonderful ways of trying to keep people alive longer and longer. And when it comes to helping people to die well, we don't bother. It isn't important. It isn't worth spending any money on. And do you know who's responsible? I have to say, to be honest, it's you, the general public, or it's us, the general public, who have not banged the drum and not insisted. In fact, we find the whole issue of dying rather uncomfortable, and we don't really want to think about it too much. Whereas if you've got a new cancer treatment, oh yes, I'll give a lot of money to that, and I'll go on sponsored walk for that. So actually, I'm afraid our priorities have become hopelessly distorted. And instead, I mean, we live in a rich country. We do actually have the best palliative care services in the world. But I'm afraid that's not saying very much for the rest of the world. I mean, they're not bad here, but they're a lot worse elsewhere. We could have absolutely wonderful palliative care services if only we shifted our priorities within the NHS. Much of the end of life that you mentioned as a good death relates to people who are still able to communicate and make decisions. This doesn't relate to many years of dementia when the person is not really there. Are they actually still alive? I'm sorry, because I ran out of time, I had meant to talk briefly about dementia, and I couldn't. I think it's a very important question. It's actually a spiritual and theological question. I believe very strongly that actually the person is still there. You know, you sometimes hear people say, oh, that's not my mother. My mother died 5 years ago. That's just some thing in a bed. Well, I understand why people say that, but it's not the truth. The truth is that the mother is still there, but obviously deeply affected by disease. And because of the disease, the contact with the person has become very much impeded and difficult. What many people who care for demented people and specialists say is that what you often get are little windows of lucency. Sometimes they only last minutes, when suddenly and miraculously the person is there. And you can have really quite an intelligent conversation, and then suddenly it goes. So, and of course, you really need to use those windows of lucency. The people who are really experts in dementia care, again, like specialist palliative care doctors, they're often extraordinarily good at establishing communication with people when you would think it was completely hopeless. But I also think spiritually, for those who are believers, you do not know what is going on at a deep level. And this was really brought home to me by a friend of mine whose father had been a great man of prayer and then had been affected by dementia, and she'd ended up caring for him. He'd become virtually mute. She was caring for him at home. And he was slumped in the armchair and staring at the television, and it happened to be Songs of Praise, and it was a program about prayer. And on an impulse, she said to him, "Do you still pray, Dad?" And to her surprise, he said yes. He hadn't spoken for days. And she said, "What do you say to God when you pray?" And there's a pause, and he says, "I say, hello." And that was it. But I thought, actually, what more do you need to say to God? And perhaps in our middle-class way, we overvalue the cerebral, the rational, the theological. And perhaps for those where the rational and the cerebral is being stripped away, at a deep way, in a way that perhaps we will never discover unless perhaps we too find ourselves in this position, you can say hello to God. There can be a still. So the person is there. And what the Christian faith teaches us is the person is held utterly secure in God's hands and in his knowledge. Because God called this person from before the foundation of the world and loved them and cared for them and brought them into this world and worked in them and transformed them and by God's grace, if they become a believer, redeemed them and so on. And he holds their identity completely intact so that in the new heaven and the new earth they will be raised. Nothing will be lost. Nothing will be forgotten. Nothing will be and therefore we need to treat people not just in the light of who they once were, but in the light of who by God's grace they are going to become. We treat even now this person with a wrecked body with respect and with compassion and with dignity. Why? Because they too, like us, are on the journey, and the journey doesn't finish here. The journey is going to go on. And so I think we express our belief that this is not the end of the story by the way we care, by the way we point to, we will meet again.
Okay, thanks, John. John's dealt there with about 8 particular questions. And I've put some on one side because they were also around about some of the, what you were talking about there. Some more particular questions though, John. Why is euthanasia a doctor's decision? Why not a pharmacist or prison officer or a family?
Yeah, very interesting. So, again, I skipped out the bit about the history of the medical profession, which goes back to the Hippocratic doctors, where before the Hippocratic era, doctors were also killers. The same skill, the same knowledge that helped you to heal somebody also allowed you to kill them. And in fact, if you go to the African villages and you meet the medicine man, what you will discover is that that is still true today in the African villages. The medicine man is the one you turn to when you need healing and you've got some horrible disease. But the medicine man is also the person you turn to when you want to get rid of your rival, the person who's sleeping with your spouse, your business rival. You go to the medicine man because the medicine man has the skill, has the expertise, has the drugs, has the knowledge. So he with the power to heal has the power to kill. What happened in the Hippocratic tradition was, for the first time, a group of healers said, we will only use our medical and healing skills for good, and we will never use it to harm the patient. And so for the first time, there was a separation between the healers and the killers. And that's the reason, of course, the reason they did that is that so they could be trusted. You never trust the medicine man. When you go to see the medicine man and he says, I think you should take these herbs 3 times a day, you're never quite sure whether these are genuinely going to help you or whether somebody else has got to the medicine man first. So it was the Hippocratic doctors said, you can trust me, I'm a doctor. That's really where that whole concept came from, because I will only use my skill to heal. And that's why doctors in this Hippocratic tradition have refused to be involved in using their skills to torture people, in using their skills for political purposes, to sedate dissidents and give them psychogenic drugs. They've refused to act as active combatants on warfare and be involved in killing. They refuse to be involved in judicial execution. As doctors, we commit ourselves only to heal, only to protect life. So, of course, therefore, there's a sort of irony that now the proposal is the doctors will become again the killers. You could argue that the doctors are the last people who should be involved in euthanasia. Much better to take someone off the street and train them up and make them a member of the Royal College of Euthanasiologists. And actually, it would only take about 3 months. It's quite easy to teach people to kill. It's keeping them alive that's the tricky bit. So you could train up a euthanasiologist off the street quite easily. Sadly, of course, that isn't being proposed. Why is it proposed to the doctors? Well, answer, because doctors are the ones we trust. Those nice, cuddly, friendly doctors, they'll never do any harm. Actually, that argument you hear less of ever since Shipman, who became the most awful mass murderer of British legal history, but was widely recognized to be the nicest and most caring doctor in the particular town in Hyde where he worked. So, the idea that you can always trust doctors and they'll never abuse their position, I'm afraid, just isn't true. Doctors are human beings like anybody else, and they can also be subject to all kinds of evil influences and desires. So I think I personally want to hold on to this unique role of medicine and say it's an honorable tradition that's been going for more than 2,000 years. Let's not toss away 2,000 years of medical history and turn doctors back into killers.
Okay, thank you. That also deals with the other one that I had there. Here's a question particularly around suicide. Many people who are suicidal and have failed suicide attempts don't actually want to kill themselves, but are desperate for help. And in countries where assisted suicide is legal, how is this accommodated, if at all?
Well, absolutely. And I think, of course, we're all taught and see that suicidal thoughts are one of the cardinal symptoms of depression. And it's really important that we try to look out and recognize suicidal thoughts in ourselves and in others, because with the right kind of support and treatment and help, suicidal thoughts can be treated. The important thing is that you need to ask the question. And that means you need to ask the question, and the best question to ask is something like, have you ever thought of harming yourself? And because people will often answer that question, and you may be horrified by the answer. Oh, well, actually, yes, I've been planning to kill myself for the last 3 months, and I've worked out these different ways of doing it, and I've got the tablets, and I'm just choosing the right opportunity. So we can help one another by recognizing that the desire to suicide is often a cry for help. It's a cry for love. It's an act of despair and hopelessness. And, what palliative care doctors often talk about is that we need to answer the question behind the question. So when someone says, "Why don't you kill me?" the answer is not, "Well, I'm not allowed," end of story. But the question is, well, why do you want to be killed? What are you worried about? What are you frightened about? What is driving you? And it's trying to address the deep pain. Often it's psychological pain, it's relational pain, it's spiritual pain. And trying to listen and understand what the pain is, and then find ways of saying, despair is not, there's always something that can be done. There's always ways of helping. It may not be physical, it may be in other ways. And ultimately, we can be there. I love the definition that Joseph Piper, a Catholic philosopher, said, and he said, "Love is a way of saying to another, it's good that you exist. It's good that you're in the world." Love is a way of saying to another, it's good that you exist. The trouble with euthanasia and assisted suicide is it says exactly the opposite. It's bad that you exist. I agree. It'd be much better for the world if you didn't exist, and I'm going to help you. That isn't love. Not in the Christian understanding. Love always says, even to the person in pain, even to the person despairing, even to the person disabled, even to the person with dementia, it's good that you exist. It's good that you're in the world.
Some of the questions, John, circled around societal pressures and changes. You touched on this in your talk as well. During this time of austerity, do you think there's pressure on society to encourage people to die? And someone asks, many would still regard a change in the law as inevitable 5, 10, 25 years. What are the likely consequences for Christians in the medical and caring professions? And why do you think society's pressure groups are so keen to have doctors involved in assisted suicide, euthanasia, and so on?
Yeah. Is it inevitable? Well, I don't think it is. And in fact, I would have been much more pessimistic if you'd asked me this question 3 months ago. But having seen the way that Parliament responded, and seen the way that when you really have a well-informed debate, that actually people can see that this is not the way they want to go. It's not that there is a better alternative. I don't think it is inevitable. And I think because of a lot of it is because of Cicely Saunders and because of the expertise in palliative care. That argument came time and time again in the debate in the House of Commons. And I think, sadly, this is part of the reason why it's spreading across the states, because the states has this very strong emphasis on individualism and autonomy and choice, but actually has pretty ropey palliative care services in many places. And therefore, the argument in favor of suicide seems much stronger. I don't think it is inevitable, but I do think it might happen. And it's not surprising, that suicide and euthanasia were very common in the ancient world, and in many ways suicide was a, quote, pagan way to die. It was the non-Christian way to die. Then, with the rise of the Christian era and the influence of Christianity across Western civilization, suicide and mercy killing and so on is something that is outlawed and is seen as wrong and never celebrated in societies influenced by Christianity. Lo and behold, as the influence of Christianity is declining in our society, and as many people think we're entering a post-Christian era, lo and behold, suicide is being rehabilitated as a noble and an honorable way to die. So I think you could imagine that if that post-Christian forces becomes much, much stronger in our society, that yes, ultimately suicide will be seen as we rehabilitate it as a noble and responsible way to die. what would the effect be on the NHS? What would the effect be on Christian carers? There are large numbers of Christians and also people, for instance, from the non-Christian religions, Muslims, Orthodox Jews, who would also agree that this is not the way to go. I think actually, paradoxically, it might be a strange kind of opportunity, because I think what may well happen is you would get a splitting into secular pro-suicide euthanasia hospitals and, quotes, pro-life palliative care hospitals. And those who were committed to this understanding of human life as precious and special and to be loved will concentrate in certain areas. What I can tell you is that if you had the choice of those two hospitals, that the general public will beat a path to the Christian hospitals. And it's something, as a thought experiment I've often done. I've done this in public debates. I paint a picture of two hospitals. This one is built on explicitly secular lines where autonomy, everybody chooses their own thing. Individual choice. If you want to kill yourself, that's fine. We maximize choice. If you don't want a treatment, that's fine. There's that hospital. The whole hospital operates like that. And over here we have a Christian hospital that says all life is precious, all life is special. We will treat you, we will love you, we will give you palliative care, but we won't kill you. Now, when your elderly mother, demented, confused, and incontinent, is going to be admitted to hospital, which hospital would you like them to be admitted to? You'd be amazed at the number of card-carrying secularists who would say, well, logically and rationally, I would say, yes, this hospital, but actually, I'd like her to go to this hospital, please. So intuitively, that way of caring, that way of running a hospital, that way of running a society is something which still many people, even though that rationally they can see no rational basis for it, actually that's where they would prefer to be. That's where they would prefer their loved ones to be. And so who knows whether in the future there may be greater opportunities for the difference between different philosophies, different ways of caring to actually be revealed. That's what happened in the early church. Because the way that the early church cared for people, there are most remarkable stories of what happened when plague swept through ancient towns, and the contrast between the way that the pagan people treated people dying in these epidemics, which was horrific. What the Hippocratic physicians all did as soon as plague entered the town was they head for the hills and get away as soon as and protected yourself. People have noticed that the descriptions of plague from the Hippocratic doctors were surprisingly vague compared with the descriptions of all these other diseases, and that was largely because they'd headed for the hills. But what did the Christian churches do? And the remarkable way the Christian churches did, they loved and cared for the plague victims. They did basic nursing care. They practiced Christian care. And when the pagan people saw this example of practical, compassionate, sacrificial caring, they were so impressed that was one of the primary forces which led to the explosive growth of the early church. So who knows what the opportunities will be in an increasingly secularized future. I don't think we should therefore be despairing. God is still the God of history.
John, we really do need to begin to draw to a close. What about those of us who aren't in caring professions? We're not professionals in this area, but we're serious about engaging with this debate. And what would you be saying to us? And just in the last few moments.
I suppose I would be saying, please get informed. This is not an easy debate, and I'm afraid I often hear Christian people saying things which reveals that they just are not well informed, that they are, and often very influenced by the media, which gives a very distorted and very unreal picture so often. There are 500,000 people a year who die in the UK, and there are about between 20 and 30 who go to Dignitas. And yet if you read the broadsheet newspapers and the BBC, you would get the impression that every other person was going to Dignitas. They represent a tiny, tiny reflection, tiny proportion. So I think we have to be informed. I think positively, here is an opportunity to start talking about what it means to die well, what it means to die faithfully, what it means to die in a way which is consistent with the Christian faith. And I actually think that's a great opportunity. It's an opportunity for us as individuals, because as I say, I passionately believe that dying well can be the most wonderful opportunity for growth, for healing of relationships, for learning, and fulfilling dreams and for instructing the next generation and so on. But I also think that it could be an amazing witness for a secular society. You know, people by and large are tired with the arguments about is there life after death and is religion a force for good or evil, and all these sort of, I'm afraid, I think sometimes apologetic discussions don't lead very far in our secular society. But when people see the reality, when they see Christian ethics incarnate, being actually lived out, when they see mutual burdensomeness, when they see respect and the dignity for those who are weak and disabled and aging, then I think they see something which is utterly compelling and powerful in our society. So I think there is a new opportunity here for the Christian community to rediscover these ancient truths about what it means to live well, what it means to die well, and to be a witness to a fearful and a despairing society. And it isn't easy. I know it isn't easy. I've been through my own experience of illness, of psychiatric illness, of dependence, and I know the pain and the indignity and the shame. So these are not easy things, and yet my testimony is, and I'm sure there will be many people here who would say that through these experiences of loss and dependence and pain, God and His grace can bring blessing and healing and redemption. And that is the Christian message. That's the story of the cross. And in a small way, our own lives can reflect this wonderful story.
John, thank you very much indeed. You've done us a treat. You've packed in an enormous amount, and it's been incredibly informative. But we know that you're not just speaking as an armchair theoretician, but someone who's been involved in these decisions yourself as a professional, and yet also with the heart of Christ as well. And we celebrate your compassion and your sympathy. Let's show our appreciation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
For those of you who registered for this evening's event, we'll be in touch with you and would be grateful for your feedback on the evening. Those of you who came with a friend who haven't registered for the event tonight, if you'd like to stay in touch with us here at LICC or hear more about the work that we do, there's a sign-up sheet at the back or in the reception. Please take the items that were on your chair as you came in. Thank you again, folks, for your presence with us, both here in the building and those of you who've been able to join us via live stream. As we conclude our evening, let's do so in prayer. Let's just spend a few moments as we pray together. And as we do so, I would like to leave a little bit of space for any of us for whom this topic hits home personally, whether through our own experience of suffering and pain, or that of relatives and friends. Just a moment for us to bring that to the Lord in prayer. And we want to pray as a body of people that we commit you to the care and the compassion of Christ in all your vulnerability. And Lord God, we pray as those who own Christ, we want to acknowledge you as the one who creates us, the one who redeems us, and as John has reminded us this evening, the one who loves us, our lover. And we thank you that when you save us and call us as disciples, you call us to a total way of life, as total people, made in your image and then remade in the image of your Son. And we ask that you would help us never to lose sight of that and the significance of that for ourselves and for the calling that you place on our lives. We give you thanks for John, for his life, for his work, for his teaching, for his writing. We ask for your blessing on him, that you'll strengthen him for all that he does. Give him wisdom in his ongoing work and the love of Christ in all his dealings with others, and bless his family too. And for all of those, Lord, including us this evening, who continue to wrestle with these issues, we ask for wisdom, we ask for compassion, we ask for sensitivity, we ask for that sense of dependence, not just on each other, but supremely on Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen.